So excited to have you here. For those I haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Scott Thompson, co-CEO, founder of Acceleration Point. Really excited to have you here today. We've got two amazing guests joining us to share something that we teach as part of our MedImpact model. So I'll get to that in a moment. This is an interactive opportunity. We get a lot of energy when people ask questions and get involved. I'm going to just set a little bit of context before introducing our speakers. When we've been working with medical affairs teams, over 35 of them this year, around how to talk about, measure, and communicate the impact of medical affairs. What we have found is that there's this balance needed between what is an impact measure and what is the contribution of a team. But we still get asked all the time at the end, well, we still need to know if we are fulfilling on our commitments. Do we have enough resources? Are we spending our time the right way? And so there's still this kind of execution metric that is needed in order to communicate to the organization. And so what we're going to do today is I'm going to give you just a quick overview of kind of the context of medical impact and how we teach. And we have a whole webinar just on the rest of this, which we'll put in the show notes if anybody needs it. But then we're going to zoom into specifically the capacity of your field team and how do we communicate how many of things we're choosing to do based on our strategy and that we have the capacity to do based on the size of our team. So drilling in, why are we doing this? So there's a couple of challenges that we often hear when we are doing MedImpact work. The first is that metrics don't tell our real story, right? When we only focus on execution metrics, how many interactions do we have? How many people do we meet with? How many topics do we discuss? All of that. It doesn't tell the real story. The second challenge that we hear is that it doesn't capture quality, right? So you can't just be about quantity. How many things did we do? We also need to know about quality. Is it making an impact? And the third is that we have trouble sometimes communicating in a way that commercial and executives understand, because how we count repeatable, scaled interactions on the commercial side can't apply the same way to medical. And then the last thing that we hear is that when we've tried in the past to come up with standards, there's differences from one therapeutic area to another, even within the same organization, where at different parts of the life cycle, doing something in specialty care might be very different than doing something in general medicine. So how do we take all of that into account? So those are the big challenges that we often hear, and we need the ability to communicate in a different way. And so that led us to introducing to the medical community the MedImpact model, where we talked about, well, what is the impact that medical affairs is trying to drive, which is a changing clinical behavior driven by changing beliefs that we accomplish by increasing awareness of specific science. And again, we have a whole webinar on that we'll include in the show notes if you'd like access to that. And then we have the contribution that individual teams make. Today, we're focused on field medical. What are the outcomes they're driving? What are the responsibilities? And how do you measure if those things are making an impact? Are our thought leader engagement is impactful? Or our HCP education programs impactful? Again, that's all part of this other webinar on MedImpact. Today, we are going to zoom right on in here to the execution component of the model and talk about how do we know if we have the team focused on the most important things, and how do we talk about the capacity that our team has to do that? Should that mean that we do 100 of something? Does that mean we should do 5 of something? And how is that different across teams? So for that, I am really excited to have with me today 2 speakers from the Acceleration Point team. First, I would like to introduce medical affairs legend, Linda Traylor, joining us to talk about this topic. Linda, do you want to give a quick introduction?
Absolutely. Yes. So I have been in industry for a very long time. I don't think that necessarily makes me a legend, but it does certainly make me older than most. So I started out my career in clinical and regulatory and moved over to traditional medical affairs role early on in my career, and have been in there over nearly 25 years in medical affairs. Hey, Katrina, tell out, man. So it really is a lot of what we're going to talk about today is something I've done and struggled with over my career, and never really done formally. And I think that's one of the things that we as medical affairs, we don't think about the formality of putting together what is a capacity calculation. Back in the napkin is usually what we've done most of our careers. And so it's really going to, I think, I'm getting distracted, but hey, shout out. I love it. So thank you. But yeah, this is going to be a fun conversation, a needed conversation, and all of something that we all know. But every time I've been working with Acceleration Point as an employee now for almost 2 years, but I've known Scott and team and the founders for over a decade, and they have best in class models and frameworks. And and many of you have heard me say, am addicted to frameworks. So I'm in the right place. And because there's so much noise, and keeping it simple and drilling down into things that matter is what I'm all about.
And with Linda today, we have, and I'm so excited to introduce you to her, our very own head of medical analytics, data guru, Christine Jackson, joining us, who has taken this model and made it into a tool that we're going to make available to all of you. So Christine, do you want to give a quick hello?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. So as Scott said, I run a department of analysts at Acceleration Point. All of our data-heavy projects come to us because that's where we thrive. One of my favorite things about working at Acceleration Point, and it's one of the things that we actually get to highlight today, is how we use data to either confirm or refute popular beliefs. And so with this capacity, like you might have this capacity model, you might have something in your head that you believe to be true. And this is something that we can lay out and confirm or enlighten you that this actually could be, your thinking might be a little bit off once all the facts are aligned. And that's my favorite part about data. And it's one of my favorite things that we get to do here.
Love it, Christine. So excited. Yeah. As many of you have been on other sessions with me, one of my favorite sayings, you don't get the joke, you won't laugh at the punchline. Right. And so if we don't agree on the premise of what we're trying to design our team for, what is most important that we should be achieving, how much of that we could possibly do given our processes and our systems and our capabilities, well, then I don't know if I'm prioritizing the right use of my time on those things. And so what we're going to do is we're going to walk you through an actual process of setting up expectations first, right? Aligning with your organization of what is possible. And then step 2, prioritizing which of those things we choose to do based on our strategy so that we get to that result. And so I'm going to turn it directly over to Linda, who's going to start walking us through the process, just like we do when we're live with an individual medical affairs team. We're going to go through it step by step, but we're going to be asking for your input along the way. So Linda, over to you on some of the core principles here.
So when we think about execution, we usually just go straight to the activities that we do, and it's not necessarily connected to the impact we're trying to make. And that's what's so valuable about the impact model, is making sure the 3 distinct exercises, defining your impact, defining the team's contribution, and making sure they have the ability to execute, are 3 distinct pillars and exercises. But the execution strategy should be developed in context of what you're trying to accomplish as an organization, as individuals, as a team. So, and it has 3 key ingredients, and these are all critical components: the capability, do your teams have the resources and training and tools for accomplishing how they execute? And then capacity. Again, most of my career is like calculating, okay, there are 260 work days in a year, and I take out like on the back of a napkin, all of these like vacation time, etc. It was okay, I will estimate, and then you give a number, and okay, that's my days of work. And we forget to do things like also when we take our teams out of the field to do in-house meetings or, making sure you give them their vacation time. So I don't always take all of it. You still have to put it in your capacity model. And so we want to encourage them to take it. The other part of it is the priorities. And this is also a challenge that most teams have is really honing in on the key priorities in any given time. And they change. Priorities change based on what you're trying to accomplish in the immediate and in the long term. But the immediate prioritization strategy has to be communicated clearly and distinctly for your teams to not get paralyzed by thinking everything's a priority. And it's a key component. So prioritization is going to be something we spend time on today. And we're going to go through every one of these. We're about to go to work. I hope you showed up to go to work because you're going to work. I have been in medical affairs long enough to know that this is something that we still haven't conquered as medical affairs professionals. And we know how to overanalyze everything. So keep it simple. There are infinite ways that you can estimate or, levels of detail and variation and how to validate. We're going to focus on a full capacity model and going through very distinct steps on calculating the capacity of your teams based on your company's operational excellence model. And then we're going to start with the easiest. If we don't keep it simple, then we're going to start writing out things like, KME engagements, virtual, email, and face-to-face. And that's just one activity. And then you start with 10 activities, you have 4. That's 40 some odd activities. Let's keep it simple because really in the end, you're empowering your teams to execute and not paralyze them.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're going to roll up our sleeves and start building a plan. And we're going to start by keeping it simple. We'll show you at the end how to add more nuance, how to add the complexity that makes it different for an MSL versus a senior MSL, somebody in the city versus somebody in the flyover states, right? So we will get into the complexity. So just stick with us. We're going to start with a basic model and then we'll evolve it from there.
Okay. Step 1 is pretty straightforward. We're going to do some basic math. And we all know how to do basic math, but let's think about the things that if we're going to calculate the number of days that our teams have to work, we have to think about any time we pull them out of the field or they are out of the field to work. So identify that available capacity. And that means remove any unavailable time. So let's go to the next slide and take a look at what that can look like.
So let me just ask everybody here real quick. If you have 365 days in a year, everybody has the same number, that's the baseline, and you remove MSL's vacation time, sick time, time that you have them in home office meetings, team meetings, not the stuff that pops up as a webinar here or there, but like out of field. How many days in the year do you have available to accomplish all of your engagement goals around thought leader engagement, HCP education, training, site support, all of those things? How many days per field do you actually have? Just everybody put in what you think, right? 150 days, 80 to 90 is Todd, 300. And it keeps those people in the field.
And pick out a weekend. So let's actually start with weekdays, 260.
Okay. Yeah. So remember, you're starting at, there's only 260 weekdays. 190, 185, 200. Okay. So why don't we share kind of some averages that we've seen across all of the teams that we've done this far. Okay.
And you're going to be amazed. So when we do this exercise with our clients and teams, real time where we're calculating, it's always surprising to people the number of days out of field. And what we've shown here is some basic averages for the key things that you need to consider. But there are other things, like this is the base that you're removing from your days of working. But usually every organization has some other things like professional development and cross-functional training that they do, or any type of other thing where you're removing them from the ability to do their work. You have to take those days out of the capacity model. So vacation on average is 3.5 weeks per year. I've seen, and obviously Europeans have 6-ish, and I've seen on average 3.5, but I've seen 4.5, 5. And this also might vary based on your title. You get more vacation days if you're more senior or a leader type of thing. So there are ways that you can calculate. We've got a tool we're going to be using today that shows you how you can do that. I've seen up to 14 holidays in some companies. I have seen something, let me just let you know, the lowest I've ever seen any company calculated available dates for their field team is in the 90s. I know, shocker. But I have never really seen it like full on 185 days. That's to me, the max, the kind of cap there is a high in my experience. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I'm just saying in my experience of working with clients and when I was a leader of MSLs, the 185 days is a high number on average. So administrative days, most times people calculate like half a day a week. If, you might look out on a quarterly basis or on a, however long this is the conversation you have, because I think some of the key points here is the baseline data that once you get to that number, we're going to use 185-ish today as our number, as a max, but keep in mind that you need to have a conversation to be able to do that. The next thing is identify the activities that you have to reserve time for. It's on purpose, putting them in your plan. Your team has to do scientific engagements, super face-to-face, and other types of engagements. Your team has to do educational events. Your team has to train speakers. Your team has to do certain events. This is the time where you as a leadership team put on paper all the activities that your team does.
So one of the things when we're planning capacity is you don't want to plan capacity for every little small rock you're going to do. This is about planning the capacity for the things that are going to drive your medical mission forward. These are often the things that we most typically will hear. So in the chat, please just put one at a time, put a 1, put a 2, put a 3. What are the things that you would say are the most important in your MSL team that you need to reserve capacity for? And so Vanessa said, number 1, you could also come in and put another one, right? So thank you. Yeah. Let's just see, what are the things that are the biggest? Because what we're going to do is we're actually going to show you the model today, and we're going to use the ones that you vote as most important. Okay, so go ahead and vote. And by the way, if we missed something that your MSL team is spending a lot of time on that you need to plan capacity for, because it's one of those deliverables, go ahead and just type that thing into the chat also. Okay, so most teams are focused still on KOL and thought leader engagement, making sure we save time. Yeah, so here's a question for you, Linda.
Yeah, so we've seen it, Christian, both ways, where anytime you engage a KOL, wherever that happens to occur, it occurs in the KOL engagement planning activity. Now, sometimes teams will develop specific Congress-related goals, and they might do some sort of calculation for that specific to a Congress. But for the most part, I would say, yes, the KOL engagements that happen at a Congress is a KOL and thought leader engagement, regardless of where it happens in general.
Okay. All right. So we have our list of activities. I'm just going to check in over here with Miss Christine Jackson. Christine, did you catch those activities? Are they built into the machine?
So we're going to go with KOL thought leader engagement, reactive responses to HCPs, and payer HEOR presentations.
Yeah, let's throw in HCP education programs also. I think
we can throw in HCP education programs also.
Yeah. And again,
Perfect.
For everybody, as you're building out your model, we're going to show you the example of the tool at the end. You're going to be able to get a copy and you can change these. You can change the amounts and everything. We're going to give it to you here at the end. Okay. All right. Let's pass this back on to Linda for the next step.
Absolutely. In the end, the model that we're going to be using today for capacity planning is going to be using the full capacity model. Now, there are a number of ways you could do it, but the full capacity model looking at each line item individually and saying, if you did nothing else but that one thing, how many can you do in a week? And then we're going to do that for every exercise. And we're going to really make sure that we say, is it really full capacity? What parts take the most time? And when we get into things like KOL engagement, you can go a little bit more complicated and separate out travel time and separate out prep time and count only the KME engagement time. But most, from my experience in doing this with clients, is most people put in, like, they define the whole KOL engagement as all of the components of it into one. So we'll talk about that. And we may keep it simple and just do prep time and actual meeting time and follow-up time. That's usually the most common way, because travel time is oftentimes a separate calculation itself. But those are the things you need to think about as you're estimating how many you can do in a week if that was all you were doing.
Absolutely. This part of the conversation is always kind of an aha for people, because typically we end up in a circular argument. I can't do that much KOL engagement because I'm also doing HCP programs. I can't do that many HCP programs because I'm also doing internal training. I don't have time for internal training if you want me to do all of. And so what we do is we establish a baseline to begin with, right? And so let's try this. Let's just try it together, see how it goes. Let's take one of them. So let's take KOL engagement. Here's what I'm going to ask you. If all your MSL was doing is KOL engagement, I don't even care if it's face-to-face or virtual. Let's just assume it's face-to-face, right? Get somewhere, have the interaction, prepare for that interaction, record, document it afterwards in your CRM. If that's all that your team was doing, roughly how many do you think you could do in a week? Put that in the chat. I'd love to see the variation here. How many do you think you could do in a week if that's all your MSL was doing? Okay, 1 a day, 2 a day. Okay, every couple of days to 1 a day, 2 a day. Okay. Okay, a couple a day. Yeah, and we're not talking, and there'll be spikes and there'll be valleys, right? There's days that I'm at a conference and I see 8 people, and there's going to be days that I can't see any. But just over the course of a year, Dan's saying maybe 1 a day. Great. How does that change if we are talking virtual, right? If we were doing virtual interactions, right, through Zoom meetings, so you have to take the time still to get them on calendar, prepare for them, present right up. Does that change? I'd love to see what you think about virtual. And again, we'll show you averages that we found across our team here, but love to see what you think. 10 a week, 15 now, because you could probably fit 3 in a day. If you had a morning and afternoon, a late afternoon, you could get into double digit. Yeah, that's what we see. Great. I'm going to ask one more question. Let's take HCP education programs, right? So these are the programs where you have to make people aware that you're going to have the program. You have to prepare your materials. You have to find the location. You have to get contracting done. You have to, show up. You have to set up. You have to do your presentation. You have to write it up afterwards. Again, you might not choose to do this many, right? Based on your need for it. But if that's all your MSL was doing, how many of those could you do in a week? If that's all you were doing, 1 or 2, 1 a day. Yep. Because you can spend most of your days getting ready for the ones 3 or 4 weeks out, right? You could do a couple a week again. Yeah. Okay. And when I usually see these numbers, I ask the question, well, what is the biggest barrier to being able to do more? Right. And so sometimes people say, well, we just don't have that much interest. Well, that's not a capacity issue, right? You just might not choose to do that many, but you could do more. And the other thing that I hear is, well, it's all the getting people to register and be aware of it and know that it's happening. And by the way, that becomes an amazing mission to put your digital teams on, your omni-channel teams on, right? So one of the things that we'll talk about at the end is if you are truly talking about capacity here and somebody in your organization asks you, well, what would it take to be able to do twice as many, 5 times as many? You should be able to answer that question. Not that you would choose to do that many more, but how many could you do? Excellent. Great. So we have your numbers here. We'll compare them as we show you the example tool to show you some of these averages that we typically see.
And the last thing to take into consideration, the fourth step in making sure that you are thinking through your capacity planning is establishing priorities. And we're going to do this in the tool, but things like when you start to prioritize, you really start to focus on what it is you're trying to accomplish in the short term and the long term, really define what you, and this is where it has to be clear. I don't know how many times we've had MSLs ask questions during a lot of this type of planning activities is putting together a list of priorities that is way long and it just paralyzes the team. So we've got to be very clear on what the priorities are. And you can, this is like a living model. You'll be able to adjust this over time based on, it's, again, most of our careers, we've never had formal training on these types of activities, never really had any tools to use to do it other than the back of the napkin calculation. So you now have we're going to be sharing a tool with you. It's one of many, but again, Acceleration Point has this ability of creating these tools for problems that need to be solved that nobody takes the time to do and providing them to people. And boom, that's one of the reasons I'm here. But is a really fun tool Christine and her magical team have put together, and it's going to allow you, it's going to take the hard part out of doing these and allow you to also maneuver and adjust. It's a living dynamic Excel spreadsheet that you can adjust over time.
All right. So thank you for all those inputs. Okay. Now, when we do these MedImpact programs, remember, we've already talked about the impact. We've already talked about contribution. Then we get to this part. The conversation we just had with you, we take in a couple of hours to have as a team, right? We actually look to see how much of this can somebody do. We dig into what's taking up most of that time. And, again, you saw the warning earlier that Linda shared, right? Like you start with just a swag. Now, if there's a lot of disagreement in the organization on how long something takes, you can do more detailed research on that, right? You could ask the MSLs. You could do a calendar study. You could, if you really needed to, do a time study. Again, nobody wants to do that. It's really hard. But if you had to, you could, right? For a period of time and then stop. So remember, the joke is the assumptions. Now we're going to get to the punchline. How do you, after you get alignment on these inputs, turn that into a set of goals to say, well, great, for this MSL or this group of MSLs, what are my expectations of how we spend that time? So without further ado, I'm going to bring up the capacity modeler tool. And Linda's going to just walk through the assumptions that we did while Christine is making edits on the fly so you can see how it's done. And we'll show you how the assumptions that you gave us, plus some of the averages that you'll see, have led to a result. And then we'll go ahead and change some of those assumptions to show you how the tool works. Let me turn it over to you guys.
Okay. So essentially, it's the vacation time. And we've entered in on that slide that we showed where we have the baseline sort of benchmark numbers that we showed that got us to 185. We went ahead and entered those numbers in for the purpose of calculating capacity today. So that is already done. But that's where you have the ability to enter in additional things you want to. And so what we see other clients enter in are things like any type of regional team meetings or cross-functional training that the organization requires your teams to do as part of their job and removes them from the field to do their work that you're assigning to them, you need to record it here and make sure that the team have the time to do those extra activities.
Excellent. So here we've taken out of the 200 some odd weekdays available, we've taken out the capacity that is reserved for vacations and holidays and shutdowns and meetings to result in 184 days available to do the activities that we said we want to prioritize. We also, by the way, put in that we have 7 MSLs so we can see what that is across the entire team.
Okay. So this next tab is the field activities. So what we are focusing on today are the thought leader engagements, the HCP education programs, and the reactive responses and the payer HUR presentations. And we're going to take some of the averages that you gave us and that we see on average from our clients.
So here, right, we put in that we could do roughly 10 thought leader engagements, 2 HCP education programs. If we were sitting around all day just waiting to give responses to inbound HCP questions, right, we could do about 20 of those in a week or 5 payer presentations. And again, this page isn't magic. It is alignment, right? It is about getting alignment with your organization that really it takes this much time to do something. And these are the key things we do. Now, if somebody disagrees that it should take that much time, well, that's a different conversation. Now you've got goals that your medical excellence functions, your training functions, your technology functions can work on to increase that capacity to be able to do more of something and to still do it well. Okay. So then if these are the key activities and this is how many you could choose to do, the last step is to actually choose what percentage of our time do we want our MSL to spend on those activities, right? And so if we want to spend 60% of our time on thought leader engagement, 20% of our time there, we want to save 10% of our time for reactive and 10% as an example, right? And it might not be right, but if we think about where do we want the team to spend the time, that's how you put that in. And by the way, different MSLs, different roles, you might want to have spend time on different things, right? As an example, if I come back here to activity, maybe we want to purposely save time for internal committees, right? HQ work, right? And you say, you know what? I could spend, I'm just going to put 5 days a week I could spend doing that, right? And so perhaps I want to have this MSL spend 0% of their time on this, but we have a senior MSL that we want to save 5% of their capacity. So as you fill this in, you can actually create different profiles based on the different roles that you have in your organization. Christine, do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about how that results into an outcome?
So we then calculate each percentage that we prioritize, that you've prioritized against the number that you could do in a week. And then we let you know how many for 7 MSLs here. So then each MSL then in the course of a month can do with your prioritizations and with your 4 activities, can do 18 thought leader engagements, can do 1 HCP engagement program, 6 reactive responses, and 2 payer HR presentation. In the course of a year, they could do 221 of the thought leader, and then you can see going down. And then we also calculate it out by team, where you can see your team per month and your team capacity per year.
Absolutely.
Let's go back and quickly show them field team capacity, what that looks like. All right. So remember, that's where you're entering in all the time that you have to extract your teams from their working days. Field activities are those things we identified as the things that they're responsible for doing, aligned to the impact story, but sometimes organizational require certain activities be done, such as the committee work that has to be calculated in. And then this is where you're having them spend time. That's based on their role. And the KOL thought leader engagement for field medical by far is always, always in the above 50% of time. And 60, I would say, is about right. What we see across the board, 60%. This is what, field engagements where insights come from is where, education and understanding clinical practice, the behaviors we care about, that is the opportunity for us to learn. So it is a key one, but also education and all the ones you identify, you have to list. And then it's going to calculate what it is you're committing. So remember, capacity is that upper number that they have the ability to do it. Once you start to see these numbers and see what you can commit your team to contribute to the impact story, and most of the time it's collecting data against the impact story, then you can start to estimate, okay, this is the amount of data we can collect as a team based on the capacity model. Now, at an individual MSL level, it's going to change a little bit based on how big their territory is, how many KOLs they have. But on average, across the team, this is where it typically lands. And these numbers are fairly robust.
And so over time, after you get your base model, you could come back in here and say, hey, you know what? Maybe I want to do a city MSL instead of a flyover MSL. So anybody in a, New York, Chicago, LA, and maybe that you have a different set of expectations for them. Or maybe your executive MSLs have much more vacation typically than your beginning MSLs, right? You might, for different roles, want to have them spend, or maybe you expect that they have capacity to do more, right? So over time, maybe they don't need to spend as much time prepping because they know their territories. And so you might have different capacity that they're able to do. And then you might want them to spend that time differently. So what's interesting now is as you start to build out your model, watch what happens. So now let's say you go, wow, you know what? I really need to spend more time per MSL on HCP education. I really want them to do more than that. There's a demand for more. So if I come in here and say, well, actually, I want to move that to 25%, and I'm going to steal that from these payer presentations. Now we're arguing the logic that led to the change in the goal, not just randomly saying everybody should be able to do two. Or let's say you are responsible for medical excellence and technology programs. Well, you come in here and say, hey, you know what? We're going to now use digital to fill HCP education programs. And we're going to be able to cut the amount of time people spend on invitations and making people aware they exist. We're going to have technology that does that. And that's going to double the number of those we could choose our time to do. Now I go, wow, okay, now, well, you know what? Maybe I don't want to use all of that capacity on HCP education programs because I don't need to do 258. I could now say, well, great, I'm going to reduce this down to 15% and I'm going to add more time with KOL, right? So this is how you use the model to gain alignment across your organization so that you can then get to a goal that is logical, reasonable, targeted, specific, and achievable. So anyway, I would love to. So first of all, who wants a copy of the Excel file? We're happy to send it to you. Just put yes in the chat, and anybody who says yes, we'll send it to you. Oh, we even have polite yeses. Excellent. Perfect. All right. We will send that to you after the session. Do me a favor. What questions do you have about how the model works, how it's used? Let us know what you think. What questions do you have that we can answer for you? Again, we've probably filled out, Christine's probably got any of these on file now. So, we've done this a few times. What questions do you have?
I think when I was doing this with the client recently, one of the questions that came up is the prioritization, especially when they have activities such as listening priorities or directed insights questions is if you have so many, how do you know what to focus your time on? And that's really where the prioritization component of this spreadsheet critical in communicating that to your team so that they understand when they're doing their territory strategies what that looks like. Looks like we have a question then.
Yeah, there's questions coming in. Let's start with Katrina. So, how do you recommend communicating this to MSLs? It's so important that they can see and know this as well. How have you guys gone about sharing this to the MSL? Linda?
So the biggest thing is you can do it a couple of ways. Normally, when you have your team meetings, you can just prepare your normal PowerPoint presentations, identify what the priorities are in your normal medical strategic initiatives, and just show them. But the key is walking them through it, letting them know that you put the time and effort, that it wasn't a back of the napkin calculation, but it was in fact a thoughtful, cross-functionally aligned exercise that resulted in these key activities, this amount of time that's going to enable them to do their territory planning, because that's how they're going to use it, right? It's a great question.
We also have a question that I can take around how MSLs can use this, like instead of the manager or instead of the field excellence person. So I have had MSLs that I talked to at MSL Society events, MAPS events, that are really frustrated because there's no logic behind the goals. They disagree with the goals. They don't think that they're achievable. And so I say, oh, well, let's sit down and look at your goals together. So let's make some assumptions here. Tell me a little bit about your capacity. What are the things that you have as your goals? And we actually did it in reverse. We would say, well, if you are expected to hit these goals, then here is the capacity of how many you could possibly do in a week by yourself, right? And we kind of did it in reverse. And what it did is it allowed that MSL to bring up the topic of prioritization. Hey, you know what? These goals, I get them. I think we should do these things. I'm just trying to balance my time and where I should spend certain percentages of my time. And it really enabled them to shift the conversation from one that appeared to be resistance to not wanting to do hard work to I really want to do this work. I'm trying to just make sure I understand how to prioritize. So that's worked for a couple of MSLs that I've shared this with directly, and it was pretty good. We have somebody asking a question about any pushback on individualizing these based on geographies or characteristics. The only pushback I've ever had, and Linda, you might have had different pushback, is about how hard it is to do it. And so that's why in the webinar today, we said, let's just start with one model and say, hey, you know what? This is our average. Some will be able to do more, some will do less. But what we have found is that over time, people have made their models more specific. So one example that I'm seeing is that, there's certain territories that don't have the KOL universe that other territories have. And so it would be silly to expect everybody to try to engage with the same number of KOLs if there's twice as many of them, like true KOLs, not ones I'm making up just to have 30 on my list, right? In New York than there are in Nebraska. And so what this allowed them to do is to say, well, if the person in Nebraska doesn't have enough KOLs based on this capacity model, what should that person spend their extra time doing? And what we're finding is that as the demand for caregiver HCP education is increasing, they're actually doing more of that online, and they're having people in those geographies facilitate more of those because they're able to do it across territories versus doing it within their own. So that's just one example, but it's really about asking. And Kelly, if you have any specific pushback that you have in mind and you'll want to share, feel free to put it in. Linda, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, I absolutely. So I look at this from the perspective of defining your team goals, and this is going to also take the time to answer your question, Cherie, about tying it back to impact. So there is putting together your activities and defining capacity at the individual MSL level. And we've seen people enter, like, instead of putting titles, they just put people's names across the top of their MSL team and prioritize based on the individual. It's up to you how detailed you want to get. So that's one way to do it. But keep in mind, at the individual level, their capacity and their execution is something that's discussed between you as their manager and the individual. That is a you and your MSL conversation. what you're using as a leader is committing your team to a contribution that's tied directly to your medical impact. If you think about the MedImpact model. And so that's why it's important for you to look at the team level. If you're committing your team to having 1,000 or 1,200 interactions to learn about what people's behavior is on a certain listening priority or a belief statement, a belief map is what we've heard them call your impact story, and those clinical behaviors you want to impact. And so how the field team contributes to that is going out and baselining, longitudinally tracking those beliefs and clinical behaviors through data collection, i.e. insights collection. And so that is how, at a team level, you're committing your team to fill out that information based on 1,200 interactions a year, depending on the size of your team, if they're small. And that's your opportunities to collect data, to learn, to engage, increase awareness, scientific exchange, all of that they normally do. They also better be recording information you need to understand about the clinical behavior you're trying to change. And so that's where the team capacity comes into play. But on an individual level, that's between the MSL and the manager.
Absolutely. And again, I want to remind everybody, this is the third thing we talk about. When somebody calls us and says, hey, can you help us with KPIs and metrics for my field team? We say, okay, great. What's your medical affairs team trying to achieve? And what's the role that field medical is expected to play in achieving that? Right? If you don't have that, this becomes a little disconnected. So again, we have another webinar that we've recorded with our friends at Johnson & Johnson, with Janssen, that we'll include in the show notes here, so that if you want the context from that, and then zoom into here. So it's really great when these things come together. And by the way, anybody here, it seemed like from the beginning, a lot of you knew Linda. Feel free to email her, and we come out and we help teams with these. Speaking of, thanks, Brent, for the shout out. This was really built with you and your team a long time ago, because a consultant agency had come in and said, you need to cut X% of your MSLs, but there was no rationale shared about why. And so when we put the rationale together, it was actually something we were able to bring back to them and say, okay, great, I understand you're trying to do that. Which of these variables should we change so that we still hit our goals? And it was a very important tool for the CMO at the time to use in those conversations. But I love your question, Patricia. What do you do next? You crush your goals. What do we know about MSLs? You set goals, we will crush them. We always do. So what I like about this is that they are logical, they're tied to strategy, they're specific, and then it gives me confidence that I'm able to crush those goals. So, great question. Everybody, thank you so much. I have a list of people that we're going to send this Excel file to. If anybody would like help creating your impact story, we would love to help you do that. You can just put a note in the chat. We'll call you or reach out to us privately. We do a full workshop with your team across all three parts of the impact model, and then drill into this. Also, keep an eye open. We've got some amazing guests, including, I think we've got Pascal on the webinar today, and upcoming soon, Brant, our guests on our On Point podcast. We'll include that, how to get the podcast on the show notes. Again, thank you for joining us. I hope this was extremely useful, and we'll take it from there. Take care, everybody.